Yeah, in my view, the onboarding is, so what you're talking about, again, it's a different perspective, but that's the first use that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yes, that's an onboarding from a different perspective. But the kind of market that we are dealing with, actually going to App Store is where, so giving this thought for a smartphone user that you have to go to an app store, think of downloading a mobile money app. What are you going to call that app? Are you going to brand that app with your mobile money scheme?
So Mohammed, all of that is super critical. That was not in the scope of this project. So we actually had discussions about this. I don't know, Bilal, if you want to speak to this, but we had discussions about thinking about the downloading process. The ask for us from Karandaaz was design the app. The app will be in the store. We actually are experts in uptake and usage of things like that, but that was outside the scope of this project. So I think in our future conversations, we can certainly help you think through that experience and that process, but that was outside the scope of this.
Yeah, because unless we discuss that, it becomes a roadblock for everything else that happens.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, okay. Totally agree. Hold on, let me just address his other 2 points. Actually, do you want to speak to gamification?
Sure.
Go for it.
So in our ideation, we had some gamification ideas, but I think we walked away from those a little bit because we wanted to create a design that was more universal and easier for any provider to adopt and not think of what would be sort of unique differentiators that wouldn't be features that would apply to multiple providers.
It's not to say that gamification isn't important, because it is, but it is a particular point of view that certain providers choose to take. It's not used by all apps around the world. It is like a technique that is used to help drive uptake and usage. We have, we think about it in other aspects of what as well, other markets and other things that we design. But it's like it's a strategy. It's not necessarily like the core point of view or perspective of an app standalone, if that makes sense. So just to make it clear that we don't think it's not important, but when we were thinking about what's the most universal, helpful thing we can do for the Pakistani market, it didn't rise to the top as one of the critical things. That being said, what you will see, and Adam will go over it, we do have kind of a social networking, social media element to the app, a la Facebook or kind of sharing of information. That is something that we designed out for the app. But the gamification didn't feel powerful enough coming out of our research that it had to be an elemental feature of the app, if that makes sense. Yeah? On your last question around process, so we're going to talk about next steps at the end. But yes, the idea is that, again, any of this you guys can just take and use without us. I mean, we don't need to be involved. If and when any provider is actually interested in adaption, iterations, doing more user testing, and figuring out what works for your particular provider, your company, and your users, we are available. Yes, we can absolutely support you through that process. Sir.
Hi, I run an online jobs platform.
Cool.
And we've been doing apps for a while, so we have a lot of users who use our site, 9 million individuals. So the data we have has been pretty interesting to analyze while doing our apps. I was curious, you spoke about the importance of creating trust to make sure the transactions work smoothly every time and they don't feel the need to have to go to an agent because there's instability in the workflow or the app itself. One of the things that we found was, even though the number of 3G users in Pakistan has skyrocketed and everybody has apps, smartphones now, the connections are usually spotty, and it's very common for the connection to break down or not be available in certain areas or to break down in the middle of a transaction. Yes. And
in the US too, for the record.
Right. Have you done any kind of online/offline implementation, so if the net connection is not strong or it's off, you can cache the data so the user gets a seamless experience as if it was online and connected? That's been very helpful for us. I'm curious if you're doing it.
So I'll let Adam answer that in 1 second. I'm going to say one thing before. So one thing you'll see in the wireframes that Adam will go over, we spent a lot of time thinking about how to build trust and confidence in the app by using receipts and error handling messaging, and like how, if something's not working in the app, what should be conveyed to the user. So you'll see that within the app, if for example there's a network connectivity issue or there's a processing issue within the app, we have ideas about how that should be handled directly with the user. So that's one way to think about it, and then I'll let Adam speak to the online, offline element as well.
Yeah, so that's not something that you really design into the front end. In the toolkit, we make some recommendations about if they lose network, they should, pick up where they left off, and some caveats about how to approach that. But it wasn't a use case that we were testing with customers. We understand that is a constraint, especially in the Pakistani market, and providers need to think through how to handle the messaging around that. So I don't think you'll see solutions to that in our designs, but you'll see it as a consideration when you get the toolkit as things to be thinking about.
Yep. And so on that point, this is not, how do I frame this? There are still things to test. Like a human-centered design process is a very iterative process. Iterations don't stop. So just because an app goes into the market does not mean that app is never refined again. So what we did kind of like the first push, right? Now we need partners to actually start adopting some of this stuff and testing it. And once it's in the market, that's when we can start doing a lot more iterations. And that's why this next phase of finding partners to actually do in-market testing with is so critical. Because there's only so much we can do in kind of a controlled interview environment. So we think we've done a big push, but there's still a ton to continue designing and testing. So we're not pretending that we have all of the answers today at all.
I think everything you have is amazing. It's fantastic, and I agree with it.
Thanks.
I think it's a great flow. Just to share with you, we recently
Can we get him that microphone again, guys?
we recently launched a CRM application for our sales force of about 120 people, and we had a simple click in there where every time they go to a meeting, they click a button so that we're updated in terms of who's going on how many of the meetings. All of our users are fairly sophisticated. They have smartphones, they have 3G internet. But what we found was about 50% of the time we didn't get those posts. And then the sales team actually stopped using it because it was unreliable. So that's why I'm actually mentioning this, because I found this for a user base that's fairly educated and online. We implemented a mechanism where it cached the transaction offline, and the moment they got Wi-Fi or internet, that transaction entered. It's been tremendously useful for us, and that's why I raised the point.
So I'm going to put on so I'm a consultant to CGAP at the World Bank, and I work in consumer protection there. So I'm going to put on my consumer protection hat for a second to say that in financial services, there are some risks to doing that for financial transactions because data privacy and security is a huge issue. So I would just say, if and when providers are thinking about that kind of solution, you just want to think through the data privacy, security issues, where is that information stored, who has access to it, et cetera, because it's riskier with financial data than it might be. I don't know what kind of data you're handling, but financial data is it's sensitive. So yes, and I would just add an asterisk that you need to think through the data privacy issues. One thing I'll say though from the research was that a lot of the customers that we were interviewing that are maybe lower income or lower literate, many of them don't carry 3G or 4G data plans. So most of them kind of wait to do transactions when they can connect to Wi-Fi. So not that that's better or worse or anything, but it's just something to think about, that sometimes the connectivity maybe is less of an issue for this lower income segment because they're actually not relying on the data plan. They're waiting till they connect to Wi-Fi. So just interesting, unique features of this kind of market. If we can get the microphone to the gentleman in the back. Sir, welcome.
Yes, I'm an assistant professor at IT's design. My question is, like many countries, Pakistan has an estimated 10% people with disabilities of all kinds. There's visual impairment, hearing, paraplegia, physical impairment, even things like dyslexia, where you have problems in reading. So in your user cases, did you consider people who have or may have an undiagnosed form of disability? Because one of the first ways to address inclusion is also to include those people who are not part of that entire process.
For sure.
Thank you.
The answer is no. Very simply. So we're designing for the average user, kind of mass market. Not to say that individuals that fall into that category are not a critical potential market for Pakistan. They absolutely are, in the US as well, and other countries. There's only so many profiles of users that we can test with and interview. So it's possible that some of our users do have disabilities that we were not even aware of. We weren't recruiting for that or filtering for that. What I can say is in our design, what you will see is an interesting feature that may help hearing impaired customers specifically. Visually impaired customers, which is a audio feature that we've built in. Yeah, that's like it's sort of a benefit. Yeah, sir, go ahead, please.
So by audio feature, you mean in the local language or in
Yes.
English?
Both, if you
Okay.
want. Yeah, you'll see it. Adam's going to show it to you.
And I'll just add that a lot of the people that we did test the prototypes were older people who just were not sophisticated smartphone users. So to that end, we strive to make buttons big, text large,
Yeah.
which hopefully will make it accessible to a wider audience. But focusing on disabilities was not
Could be
part
a
of it.
very interesting next phase of the research.